From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
For the coup-mongers, it was a question of implementing the only way, the only thing they could do to stop our program, which was to support social rights they wanted to set back. Our gains for workers. They were not able to do this through elections, so they did it through the impeachment.
Today, we spend the hour looking at the growing political crisis in Brazil and air an exclusive, extended broadcast interview with ousted Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. She was impeached last year in what many described as a coup. This comes as Brazil is engulfed in a major corruption scandal. Dilma Rousseff is a former political prisoner who took part in the underground resistance to the U.S.-backed Brazilian dictatorship in the 60s. She was jailed for 2 years, where she was repeatedly tortured.
But when I was a prisoner in Rio de Janeiro, they did the following. They would throw water at you, and they would also connect wires to your toes when they still hadn't taken off your clothes. And they would also place on your head and ear these electric cables. The worst thing in torture is electrical shock.
We will first speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, who lives in Brazil, about how the corruption scandal has only widened. At its center are many of the right-wing politicians who orchestrated Rousseff's ouster, including her successor, President Temer, who sent troops into the streets of the capital of Brasilia this week as he faced mounting calls to resign or be impeached. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a major setback to President Trump, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has refused to reinstate Trump's ban on all refugees and citizens of 6 majority Muslim nations from entering the United States. In the majority decision, Chief Judge Roger Gregory wrote that Trump's executive order uses, quote, vague words of national security, but in context drips with religious intolerance, animus, and discrimination, unquote. The Justice Department's vowed to challenge the appeals court ruling and take it to the Supreme Court. In Montana, Republican tech millionaire Greg Gianforte has won a special election for the state's sole congressional seat a day after he was charged with assaulting a reporter. Gianforte won just over 50% of the vote, defeating Democratic challenger Rob Quist to receive 44%. On Wednesday, Gianforte body-slammed Guardian reporter Ben Jacobs to the floor and repeatedly punched him after Jacobs tried to ask about the Republican health care plan. Gianforte addressed the incident during his victory speech last night.
Last night I made a mistake. And I took an action that I can't take back. And I'm not proud of what happened. I should not have responded in the way that I did. And for that, I'm sorry.
And you're forgiven. We love you.
More than $6 million was spent by outside groups in Montana's special election. 90% of the money favored Gianforte. The Washington Post reporting President Trump's son-in-law and influential advisor, Jared Kushner, has become a focus of the investigation into Russia's meddling in the 2016 election. According to the Post, investigators are focusing on meetings Kushner had with the Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak and the head of a Russian bank, which had been under U.S. sanctions. The Post reports Kushner is the only current White House official known to be considered a key person in the FBI probe. President Trump met with NATO leaders in Brussels Thursday and accused certain member countries of owing massive amounts of money to the U.S. and NATO.
23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States.
Under NATO rules, state contributions are considered voluntary. Meanwhile, Trump made headlines in Brussels when he was videotaped apparently shoving the Prime Minister of Montenegro in order to get to the front of the group of world leaders. In news from Egypt, at least 24 Coptic Christians have died after gunmen opened fire on a bus heading to a monastery south of Cairo. The attack comes less than 2 months after 46 people died in a pair of bombings and targeting Coptic churches. In other news from Egypt, the government has blocked access to many news sites, including Al Jazeera, Huffington Post Arabic, and Ouster, which is the leading independent news outlet in Egypt. In Britain, an 8th arrest has been made in connection to Monday's suicide bombing in Manchester that killed 22 people. This comes as investigators are attempting to piece together the recent whereabouts of the suspected bomber Salman Abedi, who died in the blast. Authorities believe the Manchester-born man was recently in Libya and then traveled back to Britain via Turkey and Germany. Abedi's sister said she believed he carried out the bombings as revenge for the wars in the Middle East. She said, quote, "I think he saw children, Muslim children, dying everywhere and wanted revenge," unquote. The Manchester bombings come just weeks before British voters head to the polls for a general election. Earlier today, British Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said there's a link between foreign policy and the growing terror threat.
We must be brave enough to admit that the war on terror is not working. We need a smarter way to reduce the threat from countries that nurture terrorists and generate terrorism.
Meanwhile, in Syria, U.S.-led coalition airstrikes have reportedly killed at least 35 civilians, including 5 children in the eastern town of Mayadeen. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the strikes hit a series of residential buildings. The Pentagon's admitted in a new report at least 105 Iraqi civilians died in U.S. airstrikes in Mosul in March, making it one of the deadliest U.S. bombings of the war. But U.S. Central Command blamed the high death toll on explosives that militants from Islamic State were storing in the targeted building. The Pentagon's death estimate is far lower than previous counts. Iraqi civil defense forces initially put the death toll at 278 civilians. On Capitol Hill, bipartisan resolutions have been introduced in the Senate and House to block President Trump's $110 billion Saudi arms deal. The Senate bill was introduced by Republican Senator Rand Paul and Democrats Chris Murphy and Al Franken. In a statement, Senator Paul said, quote, "Given Saudi Arabia's past support of terror, poor human rights record, and questionable tactics in its war in Yemen, Congress must carefully consider and thoroughly debate if selling them billions of dollars of arms is in our best national security interest at this time," he said. And while President Trump was visiting Brussels on his first European trip as president, Barack Obama spoke in Berlin Thursday. He never mentioned Trump by name, but said countries should not hide behind walls. He also expressed concern that progress made on health care reform in the United States will soon be rolled back.
Certainly, I have some regrets that we weren't able to get everyone health care, and obviously some of the progress that we made is now imperiled because there's still a significant debate taking place in the United States. But the point, though, is that for those 20 million people, their lives have been better. And we've set a standard of what's possible that people can then build on.
Obama's remarks came a day after the Congressional Budget Office said the new Republican health care plan would cause 23 million people to lose their health care by 2026. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today, we spend the hour looking at the growing political crisis in Brazil and air an extended, exclusive broadcast interview with former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. She was impeached last August as Brazil in what many described as a legislative coup. Her impeachment came as Brazil was engulfed in a major corruption scandal, but Rousseff herself was never accused of any financial impropriety. Her removal ended nearly 14 years of rule by the left-leaning Workers' Party, which had been credited with lifting millions of Brazilians out of poverty. Since Rousseff's ouster last year, Brazil's corruption scandal has only widened. At the center of the scandal are many of the right-wing politicians who orchestrated Rousseff's ouster. Her successor, Brazilian President Michel Temer, is now facing mounting calls to resign or be impeached following explosive testimony released by the Supreme Court accusing him of accepting millions of dollars in bribes since 2010. On Wednesday, President Temer authorized the deployment of the army to the capital, Brasilia, as tens of thousands of protesters marched to Congress to demand his resignation. Facing public outcry, Temer has since ordered the troops off the streets. In a moment, we'll air our recent interview with Dilma Rousseff. But first, I want to turn to the interview that Juan Gonzalez and I did on Wednesday with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, who is based in Brazil. I asked him to describe recent events there.
It's amazing because we've spoken often over the last 18 months about the political crisis in Brazil, and I've long thought that you could never have a more kind of insane and unhinged political situation as was in Brazil until November 2016, when I thought actually the U.S. has now surpassed it and Brazil looks sane by comparison, and yet Brazil has once again leapfrogged the U.S. because what's going on there is almost impossible to overstate. The whole argument against impeachment all along was that in the scope of wrongdoing, whatever you think of Dilma Rousseff, the actually elected president, what even she was accused of, even if you believe it all, so pales in comparison to the criminality and corruption of virtually everybody who was surrounding her and who would be empowered once she was removed, that to remove her in the name of corruption was just so perverse, because what you were doing was actually strengthening and empowering corruption. And now you have Michel Temer, who from the start of taking over, who could never have been elected on his own, who was extremely unpopular, literally single digits of approval, has had one corruption scandal after the next. A full third of his cabinet are now the targets of criminal investigations. But what has really reached a boiling point, what caused it to really explode, was that last week video and audio tape surfaced of him meeting just 3 months ago with a billionaire or a multimillionaire executive, in which he approved and encouraged and even directed the payment of bribes, including one to his party member Eduardo Cunha, who was the House Speaker who presided over Dilma's impeachment and is now in prison, to keep his silence as part of the investigation, directing bribes to other members of his party, actually getting caught on tape ordering bribes. This is the person they installed when they removed Dilma in the name of corruption. And so obviously...
And even when they removed her, they didn't accuse her of personal corruption.
No, everybody acknowledges she's one of the few officials in Brasilia who has actually never been accused of corruption for her own personal gain. And this has been piling up, the accusations against Temer. Everyone agreed to ignore them because he was imposing austerity and privatization and willing to be unpopular as a result. So Brazilian elites wanted him in there because he was one of the few willing to do it. But it's now gotten to the point where it's just too embarrassing, even for Brazil, to have a president on tape that everyone can listen to ordering bribes, but he's refusing to resign. And so the combination of his refusing to leave office and at the same time imposing very harsh and severe austerity cuts that are harming Brazil's poorest, who have spent years listening to tales of the rich stealing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, has caused serious protests, which culminated yesterday at the nation's capital, demanding his ouster. My husband, who's now on the city council of Rio de Janeiro as part of the Socialist Party, was there. I spoke with him last night. He said he has never seen aggression of the type that not only the police used, shooting live bullets at protesters, including very close to him, but the military has now been deployed by President Temer onto the streets to battle activists and protesters. Extremely serious in a country where the Brazilian military with the U.S. government overthrew the elected government in 1964 and then ruled through military dictatorship for the next 21 years in an extremely repressive way.
Glenn, I wanted to ask you also about Lula, the former president. There are also new charges apparently on top of some existing charges against him, clearly an attempt to get him convicted on something so that he would not be able to run for president, because he's still one of the most popular figures in Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, this is the great, incredible irony, which is that, if you remove Temer, the question then becomes, how do you select his replacement? And the only two choices are you let the Congress, which is one of the most corrupt bodies in the world, choose his replacement, which would be yet another corrupt individual, or you allow the natural course of democracy to take hold, which is elections. And the problem for Brazilian elites is that if there are elections, it's highly likely that Lula, who presided over economic growth and lifting tens of millions of people out of poverty, would be elected. So imagine going through this whole political crisis of removing Dilma, destroying the Workers' Party, only to have Lula return. They're now petrified of that. At the same time, he faces serious corruption allegations. These are not invented. None of them has been proven, but they're also not jokes. And so it's almost a rush to see if the elites can make him ineligible to run by convicting him of a crime, or whether he can beat them by having a presidential election, which he's likely to win. And that's the struggle currently taking place.
So the police using live bullets, have people been killed?
Yesterday, there was at least 2 people who were shot. No one knows exactly what their condition is, but they're in the hospital. So obviously to open fire with live bullets on political protesters is as extreme and repressive as a government can be.
We're moving into our exclusive extended interview with the ousted President Dilma Rousseff. In a minute, can you describe her significance? This woman who was a guerrilla, who was imprisoned, tortured herself. She was tortured. And then became president of Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex story. I interviewed her last year. She's one of the most inspiring women on the planet in terms of her life story for the reasons that you just encountered. She's incredibly strong and resolute. At the same time, she presided over a lot of economic suffering. There's no question she mismanaged the economy. And yet in the middle of this extreme corruption, they found almost nothing on her that ever implicated her, and yet she was removed. And so her legacy is obviously pretty mixed, and yet at the same time, I think she has now found complete vindication, because that was always her argument, was the people who are removing me in the name of corruption are actually the ones who are most corrupt and are doing it to protect themselves, and that has borne out.
Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald speaking on Thursday. He lives in Brazil. Shortly after we taped that interview, the Brazilian President Michel Temer ordered Brazilian troops off the streets. When we come back from break, we'll air our exclusive extended broadcast interview with the ousted Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. Among the things she'll talk about is being tortured and jailed under the Brazilian dictatorship and how she rose to become president of Brazil. Stay with us.
Hoje você é quem manda, falou, tá falado, não tem discussão, não. A minha gente hoje anda falando de lado e olhando pro chão. Viu você que inventou esse estado, inventou de inventar toda a escuridão. Você que inventou o pecado, esqueceu-se de inventar o perdão. Apesar de você, amanhã há de ser outro dia. Eu pergunto a você, onde vai se esconder da enorme euforia? Como vai proibir? In Spite of You by Chico Buarque here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at the political crisis in Brazil, we turn now to Brazil's ousted president, Dilma Rousseff, who was impeached last year in what many describe as a coup. Her removal ended nearly 14 years of rule by the left-leaning Workers' Party, which had been credited with lifting millions of Brazilians out of poverty. Rousseff is a former political prisoner who took part in the underground resistance to the U.S.-backed Brazilian dictatorship in the 60s. She was jailed from 1970 to 1972, during which time she was repeatedly tortured. Dilma Rousseff would later become a key figure in the Workers' Party under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. She was elected president in 2010, re-elected in 2014. I spoke with President Rousseff when she came to New York in April. I began by asking her how and why she was ousted from power last year.
Olha, eu acredito que os motivos que me levaram.
I believe that the motives that led me to be removed from my position as president, and in what was really a coup d'etat, because there was no real high crime and misdemeanor in my case, I could attribute this to 3 motives.
Há três motivos.
One, which is more important than all the others, has to do with great misogyny. And for the first time, a woman was elected president.
Ao maior cargo da República por eleição. Esse tratamento misógino tem a ver.
This misogynist treatment has to do with how men and women are seen and described in politics. Women are harsh and insensitive. Men are strong and sensitive. Women, when working intensely, are considered obsessive-compulsive, whereas the man is considered a hard worker. So all of these uses of instruments to attack a woman were mobilized against me. In addition to the many low-quality words, but what led to the impeachment were two major things. One, they sought to keep the coup-mongers, from the PMDB and PSDB, two political parties in Brazil. They were trying to keep the corruption investigations from reaching them, so they said, we're going to get rid of her in order to keep the investigations from continuing and for this thing to continue. In addition, we had won 4 elections in a row with a government program that was clearly against many of the trends that were in vogue in the United States, in Europe, which were exacerbating inequality. We were fighting inequality, and we had secured some very important results. We took Brazil off the UN's map of poverty, and we lifted up 86 million from extreme poverty. We were not selling our lands without any limitations to foreigners. And above all else, we had a whole structure of social protection in Brazil. So for the coup mongers, it was a question of implementing the only way, the only thing they could do to stop our program, which was to support social rights. They wanted to set back our gains for workers. They were not able to do this through elections, so they did it through the impeachment.
Eles não conseguiriam obter pela eleição e obtiveram pelo impeachment.
The man who led the charge against you, who led your impeachment, Eduardo Cunha, now faces 15 years in prison for corruption. Your thoughts?
O que eu lamento nesse processo é o fato de que o que levou ele a ser julgado.
What I regret is the fact that what led him to be put on trial and to be convicted for 15 years, well, I'm not in a position to give an opinion about the situation of the inquiry, the right to defense, and so forth. But what I do know is that all of the evidence that led to his conviction was available to the judiciary and the prosecutorial authorities before my impeachment. The strange thing is that they let that process run before my impeachment, and they didn't take any measures. Because no one was unaware of it, there was a whole set of evidence before April 17, 2016 that incriminated Mr. Eduardo Cunha. So that's my first assessment.
17 de abril de 2016, que incriminavam o senhor Eduardo Cunha. Então, essa é a primeira avaliação que eu faço.
My second assessment is that he came forward. He wasn't just one person. He represents a very bad process in a very dangerous process, which is the following. Brazil always had to construct a democratic center for governance, and that need to have a democratic center stemmed from the 1988 Constitution, when we emerged from the dictatorship and embarked upon democracy. And having this democratic center, while it was progressive, now what happened with the arrival of Eduardo Cunha on the scene, he was ultra-conservative with respect to social rights, but especially with respect to individual and collective rights. He's a homophobic man. He opposed the women's policy, having a gender bias, for example, which is absurd. So what happened is that he led to the hegemony of the far right over the democratic center, which led to this coup. Those who are also part of the group are as responsible for the coup as he is. So the fact that he is in prison doesn't mean that those kinds of political practices that he represented were extinguished. Quite to the contrary. Today, they're all in the government, those who supported the coup, and who constitute a very strong political group along with him.
Os que o apoiaram e que compunham com ele grupo político muito forte.
In addition to Cunha, Brazil's Supreme Court ordered corruption probes into 98 politicians, including a third of the current President Temer's cabinet. Would you say part of the reason you were impeached is that they feared being investigated themselves? They were trying to stop this?
Não é só que eu acho isso.
I'm not the only one who thinks that. Before my impeachment, the press put out a recording, and that recording was a conversation between two senators. Well, one senator and one former senator, both of the same party, of PMDB, the Brazilian Democratic Movement Party. What did this recording say? One of the senators, who was a major leader of the coup, Senator Homero Zucca, said to the other one, who was recording the conversation, "Look, the president needs to be removed so that we can stop the bloodletting." Now, what does that mean? Well, he continued to explain it, because she will not interrupt the investigations into the car wash scandal. She will not interrupt any investigation into corruption. And so we need to remove her by forming a national pact that would impede those investigations from reaching us. This reason is the reason that led the politicians to carry out the coup. The politicians that always lost the elections to us, the Brazilian Social Democratic Party, the party of the last senator, and the current senator, who were foreign ministers of the Republic. And let me tell you, I don't believe that the reason that led to the coup was just that. That's part of the reason. The other part of the reason had to do with trying to bring Brazil economically, socially, and politically into neoliberal policies, because we had blocked part of the neoliberal policies which would transform the public budget into a budget empty of any social content. And this was the most important part. It was strategic to draw part of the market, the media, the big Brazilian media, to support impeachment, because they were losing hope of their programs becoming viable by democratic means. So they had to suspend democracy. But you can't suspend democracy like you might have suspended a military coup before. But they introduced exceptional measures into democracy. And one of these, which would be an exception in the United States and Brazil, would be impeachment, without what is called a crime of responsibility, and that is equivalent to what in the U.S. Constitution is called high crimes and misdemeanors. The allegation for removing the ways that I had issued 3 degrees, which represent 0.15% of primary expenditure, not even of the total budget, is 0.15%, and that I had set aside a subsidy for farmers, small, medium, and large, which is something that's been done in Brazil since 1994. It's just that. Well, they changed their understanding and had a backward-looking understanding. In other words, I was accused of something that I didn't even participate in.
Acusada de algo no qual eu nem participei, não tem minha participação.
Temer was your vice president, the man who would replace you when you were ousted.
I don't like to mention his name, but is the vice president of the Republic, who unfortunately is not someone you can trust. And I can't trust him, and Brazil can't trust him.
The Wall Street Journal just reported that a former construction executive in Brazil said that the Brazilian president, Temer, was involved in a deal to funnel a $40 million bribe to his political party, an allegation that threatens to erode his ability to govern. Your thoughts on this latest news?
Olha, eu acho que...
Look, I think that if this happened, it's extremely serious. Because $40 million, that would be 130 or 140 million reais, the Brazilian currency, This is appalling. Now, it will have to be proven. This is an accusation, and even though the president is my political adversary, I still think he should enjoy the right to defense. But I can let you know that this is very serious if it's proven. I don't think someone should be free, much less be president, if that's the case. But as I say, it has to be proven if one is democratic-minded for one's adversary as well.
Democrata é democrata para o adversário também.
President Rousseff, you have a very important history that expresses the history of Brazil. Can you talk about your years in the underground, how you got involved with politics, and then being imprisoned?
Olha, eu tinha 20 para 21
Look,
anos.
I was 20 going on 21 years old when I was 15, 16 years old. The military coup occurred. The military coup in Brazil had two moments. That moment in 1964, and then again in 1968. It was in 1968 that they really shut everything down. From 64 to 68, there was still a democratic space with people debating, discussing. It was a time of great cultural activity in Brazil. Music, theater, and the opposition movement began in the streets. There was the March of 100,000, which was so important in Brazil. In 1968, they shut things down. Shutting things down in Brazil meant the following. No one can express disagreement. If a student were to express disagreement, they would be put in prison, and they might be in prison for a long time. In addition to that, the whole process of repression began. The harshest repression. I am a person who was affected. My generation was very much affected by this shutdown, and we went into the resistance. The resistance could only be, as you said, underground, because if you were at the resisting or arguing against them, reducing workers' rights or supporting students, then you'd be put in prison.
Ou defendendo que eles não reduzissem direitos dos trabalhadores, ou que não acabassem com certas características estudantis, você era preso. Então, só tinha
So there was no way. You either had to go into the underground, and so people went underground and moved about there. In that process, gradually, as of 1968, they established a centers that were responsible for investigation, for investigating people and taking people to prison. Now, as of 1970, they began to kill people depending on their assessment of a given activist. They might kill him or her. Many of the people I worked with were killed in those situations. I was taken to prison January 16th of 1970. So I survived. I wasn't on that list of people who are going to die because it was as of September that they began to kill. So it was a very tough process for me. Why? Because you were taken prisoner. Immediately you were tortured so that you could turn in your companions, and there it was, a fight against time. Torture is a fight against time. No one is a hero in torture. People are capable of resisting. Each of us is capable of resisting his or her own way. How did I do so? Well, you try to find resources within yourself to gain time against the interrogator, and you have to keep certain things in your mind always. You know more than they do about yourself. Second, you can never believe, well, if you think you can, put up with it for a day, that's a good strategy. Or you have to put up with it for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 10 minutes. For 10 minutes is an eternity in the face of pain. So it's a very tough process. I will tell you something about women. It's very interesting. Women and men face torture. They grow weak in the face of torture because it's not a simple thing. But I will tell you about women. We have an ability to deal with pain which is different from men. I think it's because we bear children for various reasons, but what I perceived was great strength among women to maintain their integrity in the face of torture, which is very important. Torture can't destroy you, and what you have to do with respect to your companions and your colleagues to keep them from being destroyed, those who are weaker are the ones who you have to support the most so that they can recover afterwards. You can't think about your colleagues and your companions that because someone might have turned someone in or said something under torture that they become your enemy. No. You have to support them and protect them. And that's what women do very well. So it's a very tough process. No one should have to suffer torture because the military regime, but I think that those of us who experienced what we experienced, well, I learned several things. I learned how to resist. I also learned that you can't ever think that you're going to be defeated in prison unless you want them to defeat you. Defeat is not just an objective reality. Defeat is a reaction in the face of difficulty. So I suffered 2 coups, 2 blows, torture, and this parliamentary coup. And they're not going to defeat me. And I owe this to all of my colleagues who did not survive.
E te asseguro, nenhum dos dois vai me derrotar. Eu devo isso para todos os meus companheiros que não sobreviveram.
When you were imprisoned, how did they torture you?
Era assim. É uma coisa absurda, mas eles tinham protocolo.
It was absurd that they had a protocol. The protocol for torture was like this. I was taken prisoner by a military and semi-military group that was under military control. That was called Operation Mantarachas. On this, it was a center that was controlled by the Brazilian armed forces. You would be taken to immediately. There would be a strong din and murmuring, people shouting. It's a way to throw you off. And then, well, the first thing they would do in my time, well, later it was different because they'd put hood on people. But when I was a prisoner in Rio de Janeiro, they did the following. They would throw water at you, and they would also connect wires to your toes when they still hadn't taken off your clothes. And they would also place on your head and ear these electric cables. The worst thing in torture is electrical shock. And then they would do what was called the parrot perch, which is a method where they would place a stick or a bar under your knees and then place your hands on the same bar. And there they are. And they would combine this technique with electrical shock. The problem is that your ligaments begin to hurt a lot up to. And then at a certain point in time, the blood stops running and the pain diminishes somewhat. It's unimaginable. People would withstand it because we were 20 years old. I don't think somebody my age today would be able to withstand it. At the time, I was 20 years old. And if you're 20 years old, you can withstand anything. Basically, the torture was like that. Now, there is a basic component of torture in all torture, and all times of history and everywhere. The person who is torturing, the group that is torturing you wants you to perceive, first of all, that you are not part of the category of human beings, and also that no one likes you, and that no one has a relationship of understanding with you. That is to say, a relationship whereby I recognize you, you recognize me, and we haven't a certain empathy because we're the same gender or because we have common experiences for several reasons, or even just that because we're all human beings. So they want to short-circuit that perception, and they have 2 ways of doing so. Aggression, but there's also another, which was to block you. That is to say, by placing a hood over you, and you don't see the person who's talking with you. So you have an issue of sensory deprivation, and that is also very common. They want to cut off all contact with the outside world.
Te tira o contato com o mundo exterior.
You knew what happened when you became an underground guerrilla. What gave you the courage to take on the state in this way? You knew that people were being killed and that that's what you risked, losing your life.
Acho que a única coisa que faz com que a gente...
What makes people struggle in those conditions anywhere in the world is the conviction that you are fighting for a better world. You have to believe it. No one is able to struggle if they don't think that they're fighting for a better world. And we were convinced that we were fighting for a better world. More than believing in it, we were absolutely certain of it.
A gente tinha certeza absoluta que eu acho que a força que levou os movimentos...
I believe that the force that led the movements at that time in many parts of the world, not just Brazil, in the 1960s and 1970s. And there's the question of democracy. I think the most serious thing that can be done to a country during military dictatorship is for its youth to not have any hope in democracy. Because if there's one thing that you learn in that struggle, you learn democracy is the only regime, mechanism, space for action. For what? For you to be able to transform your country. Always in Brazil, when democracy was reduced, it was through these coups, through exceptional measures, through the saviors of the homeland. Democracy mitigated, and so social transformation is reduced or eliminated, or there are setbacks. I learned in life that if you have a commitment to your country, you have to expand democracy. That's why the name of this program is so important, Democracy Now. It's very important, this idea in Brazil. Democracy now, because we only win with democracy, and we lose when democracy is attacked. And so we have this expression in Brazil, democracy is the right side of history. And I believe in this because democracy is the right side of history. And democracy emerged with two concepts. There are two concepts that emerged in the time of the Greeks, which is our tradition, the concept of democracy and the concept of politics. Even where there is a selective democracy, that is to say, when it is possible to have a democracy in the public plaza, in the public space, politics means you have to take a position in society, upholding the interests of all your community or in your activity. Without that, it's impossible to have a democratic process. I don't believe that there is any country in the world with democracy without politics. Technocrats don't engage in politics in the broad sense of the term.
Por cima do processo de eleição, do processo de voto popular.
Ousted Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. Since we talked in April, the political crisis in Brazil has only intensified. Her successor, Brazilian President Michel Temer, is now facing mounting calls to resign or be impeached, following explosive testimony released by the Supreme Court in Brazil, accusing him of accepting millions of dollars in bribes since 2010. On Wednesday, Temer authorized the deployment of the army to the capital, Brasilia, as tens of thousands of protesters marched to Congress to demand his resignation. Facing public outcry, Temer has since ordered the troops off the streets. When we come back, I'll ask Dilma Rousseff, the first female president of Brazil, about democracy, corruption, and President Donald Trump. Stay with us.
A cara amarrada, perdoem a falta de abraço, perdoem a falta de espaço. Os dias eram assim. Perdoem por tantos perigos. Perdoem a falta de abrigo. Perdoem a falta de amigos. Os dias eram assim. Perdoem a falta de folhas.
To Our Children by Elise Regina, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, as we return now to my recent conversation with former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, recorded in April. Madam President, I wanted to ask your thoughts today. You were in the United States this week when the U.S. dropped the largest bomb in the history of the world. The Pentagon calls it the mother of all bombs, a massive ordnance air bomb on Afghanistan, the largest bomb in the history of the world since the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This followed last week's bombing of Syria and the continued U.S.-backed bombing in Yemen. Your thoughts?
Eu quero te dizer que, em que pese eu não ser presidente da República,
Now, I'm not the president of the Republic, but I would tell you what we would have said as president, without a shadow of a doubt. We are against that kind of action. Why? First, I don't think it resolves the problem of ISIS. Why do I think that this kind of repression isn't the appropriate approach? What I've read in the United States newspapers is that oftentimes, when bombing Syria or Afghanistan, well, I know there is no dialogue with ISIS. With ISIS, it's a different kind of relationship. But what has happened is that when bombing civilians and allies are killed. So I ask myself, what's the point of such an action if it's going to kill civilians and allies? What might someone think who's living in Syria or anywhere, and all of a sudden a bomb is dropped? I think it's extremely dangerous because those groups don't gauge consequences. It's a very radical policy. So I am extremely concerned about the reaction afterwards. That is to say, I don't believe that there is any circumstance in which we can come up with some easy answer. When the war was taken to Iraq, when the war was taken to Afghanistan, when there was a bombing done in Syria, it's very difficult. And this unleashes the whole process of such violence that the consequences are uncontrollable. How long has it been that they've been fighting in Syria and they're not able to stop ISIS? How long has al-Nusra and al-Qaeda continued doing what they're doing? So I think we need to ask about this. And I'm very concerned when civilians and allies are the ones who are killed. That's what it says in today's newspaper. So I don't think that such bombardments produce results, and I'm not in favor of dropping bombs when they kill civilians and allies, because it's just putting more fuel on the fire.
Porque eu acho que ele acrescenta fogo na fogueira.
The bomb was developed during the Bush years. He didn't use it, George W. Bush in Iraq. President Obama didn't use it. Within 2 months of the Trump presidency, they have engaged in this historic act, the largest bomb in the history of the world outside an atomic bomb. Your assessment of the Trump administration, of President Donald Trump?
I don't evaluate the performance of presidents of other countries because I'm a former president, so I don't talk about that. Obviously, I have an assessment, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to talk about it. I can talk about positive accomplishments, but otherwise, I won't say anything.
Mas se não é sobre acertos, eu não falo.
What do you feel has been done right?
I don't have anything to say. Well, I'm not going to talk about that. My assessment of the Trump administration is something I'm not going to talk about. It's not up to me to do that. That's your job.
I wanted to end by sharing a clip of Noam Chomsky with you, the world-renowned dissident linguist who recently appeared on Democracy Now! And talked about Brazil.
It was just enormous corruption. It's just, it's painful to see the Workers' Party in Brazil, which did carry out significant measures, they just couldn't keep their hands out of the till. They joined the extremely corrupt elite, which is robbing all the time, and took part in it as well, and discredited themselves. And there's a reaction. I don't think the game is over by any means. There were real successes achieved, and I think a lot of those will be sustained, but there is a regression. They'll have to pick up again with, one hopes, more honest forces that will, first of all, recognize the need to develop the economy in a way which has a solid foundation, not just based on raw material exports, and secondly, honest enough to carry out decent programs without robbing the public at the same time.
So that was Noam Chomsky, who said there was just enormous corruption. He said, painful to see the Workers' Party in Brazil, which did carry out significant measures, but they just couldn't keep their hands out of the till.
Olha, eu primeiro quero falar o seguinte.
The first thing I want to say is the following. I want to put some things in perspective. The greatest corruption in recent years occurred with the subprime crisis. Now, I don't know that as a result of the subprime crisis, I don't believe that all of the companies that were involved in corruption were destroyed. Maybe their CEOs or others who committed corruption had to answer for it, but they didn't destroy the institution. Rather, they took the person who committed the crime. The company is not a thinking and speaking entity. The company is all of its compounds together. Now, unless it's corrupt in its entirety, then you don't destroy the organization. So why do I say this? Well, first, to say that Brazil has the greatest corruption in recent years. Brazil's corruption is significant. It matters to Brazil. It has to be fought. Later, I can tell you about what my government did, but I don't think that it has to, that the party has to be destroyed. I don't believe that banks were destroyed or agencies were destroyed or that persons who were not involved were persecuted. Same thing applies to a political party, because the political party as an institution, well, some say it's different from a company, but I don't believe that one should criminalize the Workers' Party. One should criminalize and prosecute the individual members of the party who committed crimes. But one should not combat the entire Workers' Party in Brazil, which is the largest party in Brazil, without a doubt. No.
De combate político que ocorre no Brasil. Não venham combater todo o Partido dos Trabalhadores, que é, sem sombra de dúvida, ainda o maior partido do Brasil.
And I'm sorry to get so excited, but I want to explain the following. I think it's fundamental in Brazil to fight corruption. I think it's fundamental because corruption in Brazil is a way in which economic power interferes with political power. And one of the processes in this corruption is characterized by the fact that in Brazil, before, even though it's spelled out in the law, those who come to corrupt public officials have never been prosecuted. In 2013, for example, there was a law on crime-fighting going organizations that we sent to Congress, and 2 measures had been taken.
Quando todos os partidos de oposição no Brasil que não eram
So the one who made the mistake should pay for it. The law exists. It should be properly applied. The Workers' Party will answer for its mistakes. It has to, but not by putting an end to the party. Punish the individuals who committed the crime, but not the party. This whole story of punishing the whole party dates back to 1946, when all opposition parties in Brazil that had Well, the more radical opposition, the Communist Party, Brazilian Socialist Party, were made illegal. I don't agree with that whole process. I don't agree with destroying companies. I'd never seen a single bank or company destroyed. I saw CEOs have to answer. Now, what I find extremely unusual is that they take Petrobras, the state oil company, and paint it as being corrupt per se. There are many people in Petrobras who are corrupted and who are accused of corruption. So I think it's very clear the one who corrupted, the one who was corrupted should be prosecuted with the right to defense without spectacular media treatment. Because what's happening in Brazil is that the media places people on trial before the case even goes into the courts. Now, I don't think that in any democracy in the world, as far as I know, the media can take the place of the judiciary. I don't believe the media guarantee the right to defense. It plays a fundamental role in democracy. Now, the role of meting out justice has to be performed by those who have an institutional mandate to do so.
Finally, President Rousseff, in the 1960s, you were involved with the underground resistance to oppose dictatorship. Are you seeing a right-wing shift in Latin America and the United States? And what form do you think that resistance should take today?
É diferente.
Today it's difficult. I believe that our resistance today, and this is a major gain for us in Latin America, today we can resist without having to go into the underground, without rather using the most important weapon of democracy, which is the word discussion, debate. We can do that today. Before we couldn't. Before we were somehow shackled by the dictatorship. Today, our resistance and the resistance in the United States is the same. That is to say, I think we are all going through the following process. There is an increase in financialization instead of the financial industry serving productive industry and productive services and all activities. The financial sector became the master. On becoming the master, it channels to itself the largest part of income, and this produces inequality, stagnation, precarious employment, and co-optation by some of the press, which means that shareholders, CEOs, all of management are the models who are above and beyond the workers, the consumers, and so forth. In other words, it creates a world which is not going to bring well-being and affluence for the population as a whole. We're all going through that neoliberalism, financialization, greater inequality, and more exceptional type measures. Here in the United States as well. The Patriot Act, in a way, was an exceptional act because when you put persons on trial without guarantees, then, well, that's an exception type of act. This happens in Brazil with several measures. For example, a court has said that I can suspend the constitution because the car wash scandal is an exceptional event, and therefore we can suspend the law. But that's not possible. We have, in a way, a mitigated democracy that we have to expand. We are experiencing a time of greater inequality and financialization. In a way, taking stock of the history of our experiences, of our movements, we have a lot. All of us who defend democracy have a lot to share with one another.
Ousted Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. Tune in Monday, Memorial Day, when we'll spend the hour with world-renowned linguist and dissident Noam Chomsky. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Ndura, and Andre Lewis. Special thanks to Becca Staley and Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.